thing of me. I got a callus on my finger and my shoulder's hurting too. I'm gonna eat them all up just as soon as the time do. 'Cause I got Pac-Man fever. Pac-Man fever. It's driving me.
All right, everybody, we're going to move forward with our this week, where we're going to list evidence, storage formats, the best ways to determine the acquisition of such evidence, contingency planning for data acquisitions, how to use those acquisition tools and explain how to validate the acquisition methods, describe RAID acquisition methods, explain how to use network remote acquisition tools, and list any other forensics tools that are available for data acquisitions. Now, that listing is going to be pretty extensive and can get even more extensive. As time of publishing, I believe this one was set at like 2014. So the number and list has grown since then. So we've got your PowerPoint 3, which will be our lecture, your Chapter 3 discussion. We're going to be the three main formats: raw, proprietary, and acquisition or advanced forensics format. The SANS Institute document has it's pretty long. It's pretty great reading for forensics imaging. During that document, you're going to learn about a few software packages that are available and what they can do. So for your discussion this week is to read that document, find out what software is your favorite and why it's your favorite. Do some additional research to make your minimum posting length at about a page to help you figure out why it's your favorite. If it's not your favorite, that's okay. But what tipped the scale to make it not your favorite anymore? That's okay that it's not. I mean, there's going to be a lot that you're going to learn as you go through this course that you say, oh, you know, that was not the best option for me. I want to go with this one in the future. This is the one I want to concentrate or focus on. Don't forget, MLA formatting is important for quotes and any new information you may have gathered. Chapter 3 is your lab. It's going to have hands-on project 3-1 and 3-2 from your book. You'll have your Chapter 3 review questions and your Chapter 3 quiz, which makes sure you have to pass Chapter 3 review questions with a 70 to go on to the quiz. With that being said, we're going to move on today to Chapter 3 lecture, the Computer Forensics Data Acquisition. Okay? We talked about our objectives, and we're going to start off with the three formats: raw, proprietary, and advanced forensics format. Now, the raw format is a write bitstream files. The advantage is it works fast with data transfers, it ignores read errors, and most forensic tools can read that raw format. The one that you choose for your discussion, does it use raw? The disadvantage is it requires as much storage as the original disk or data. So if you're taking a 4 GB file, you have to have 4 GB of storage. If you have a 1 TB drive, you have to have 1 TB of storage because it's a bit for bit image. And some tools might not collect quote unquote bad sectors. Proprietary formats is based on the form or the tool that you are using. So for example, EnCase uses an EnCase forensics imaging. It can be used with others, some can't. It just depends on the tool that you're looking at. You get the option to compress or not compress, split it into smaller segmented files, or integrate metadata into image files. The disadvantage is, like we talked about, it can't go from tool to tool or software to software. And the file size limitation can be for each segmented value or volume. It's also the expert witness format is an unofficial format, expert witness being the software tool. The advanced forensic format developed by Dr. Simpson Garfunkel is an open source. The design goal was that you can provide compressed and uncompressed. There's no restriction. You can have as much space as you need, and you can add additional things like segmented files and metadata. It's supposed to be simple, and it's supposed to be used for multiple platforms and operating systems. Additionally, it is supposed to help self-authenticate itself. File extensions include AFD for segments and AFM for AFF meta file. And AFF is the advanced forensic format. That's the open source part of it. So what do you choose? Do you choose static or do you choose live? When is the best time to use it? Now, if you think back to chapter 1, or you walk in and you find that person has been removed from their computer, but the computer's on, it's unlocked, which method should you use, live or static? The 4 methods for acquisitions: disk to image, disk to disk, logical disk to disk or disk to data, or sparse data copy of a file or folder. That's individually plucking out what you need. Determining the best method depends on the circumstances of the investigation. Additionally, like we talked about, what you walk into. The disk to disk is the most common because it takes everything and you can make more than one copy. Disk to disk copies are bit to bit replications of the original drive. ProDiscover, Incase, FTK, Smart, Sluiskith, Xways, iLook, iX, and many more do this because it's just so common. A disk to disk is when you go from a physical disk to a physical disk, when a disk to image is not possible. Incase, SafeBack, Snap Copy. Logical acquisition and sparse acquisitions take several hours. Logical acquisitions captures only specific files, and sparse acquisitions collect fragments of unallocated or deleted data. It's for use for large data, commonly used with PST, OST, and RAID servers. When making a copy, consider the following: the size of your source disk, if lossless compression will be useful, or digital signatures are needed for verification. When working with large drives, an alternative is to use tape backup systems. Now, tape may not be so common anymore because once tape was a very common de facto standard for backups, not so much anymore. And whether or not you can retain the disk. If you can keep that drive, if the drive becomes part of your evidence, then you don't need to make a in the field copy. Contingency for planning image acquisitions: creating your duplicate copy of your evidence image file, maintaining at least 2 images for those to use through different tools and techniques. Copy your host protected area of a disk drive, as well as considering using a hardware acquisition tool that can be accessed through the BIOS level. Be prepared to deal with encrypted drives. Whole drive or whole disk encryption feature like Windows BitLocker makes static acquisitions increasingly more difficult and may require the user to provide a decryption key. That's tricky, especially when we see all the cases in the world right now, or in the wild, we could say, where keys aren't readily provided, or the accused is not providing that key. So the advantage of using it for Windows is it's just more convenient. It's more in use and is used with hot swappable. Disadvantage is you have to write protect that data. You really have to write protect that data. Tools can acquire a disk from a disk's host protected area, and some countries haven't accepted the use of write protecting devices or write blocking devices. WinMini-FE or MiniWin-FE enables you to use a forensics boot CD, DVD, and it's mounted as read-only. Before booting, you need to connect to the target drive, such as USB, and after it's booted, you list all the drives and make sure you use the right one when you do the read-write mode so you can run the acquisition program. In a Linux boot CD, you can have Linux access the drive that isn't mounted. Now, this is if you've used something like Hiram's boot disk, Ultimate Boot CD, or a few others, they're Linux based. And what's really cool about these guys is they load their own sort of RAM operating system that allows you to manipulate and look at those drives that are mounted or not mounted, and then you can forensically analyze those. Kane is another forensics tool that we'll look at later. All right. Most forensics live utilities like Kane have a ton of good stuff in them, and we'll get to that later. configured not to mount or use as read-only, some well-designed Linux live disks, Penguin, Sleuth, Fire, Kane, Deft, Kali Linux, Knoppix, Sans Investigative Toolkit. Now, I would take Kali Linux off here if it were me, because Kali is more of a intrusion and hacker toolkit than it is a forensics toolkit. Now, that's not to say it doesn't have some, it does, but it doesn't have a lot like Kane. You can see the difference between the two later in your program. So preparing your target drive for live acquisition or acquisition within Linux. You start the Linux, create the FAT and NTFS partition labels, fdiskit to show and verify partitions, mkfdosks create your FAT format. On page 99 in your book, there's steps on how to do this. Applying data with DD in Linux, data dump. You read and write from the media device and you create a raw file. Shortcomings of the DD, it does require a little bit of advanced skills for the average user. You just can't click. It's all command line stuff. And you can split them out into segmented volumes, and it does not compress data. In steps 104, it shows you how to make an NTF image on a FAT32 disk. And DCFLDD is additional Linux tool that's supposed to use data management. It's by the hex patterns or text for clearing disk spatters, log errors to an output file, several hashing options, status display for the progress, split acquisitions, and verify data for the original disk. To a write blocker device, create a storage folder on the target drive. Using ProDiscovery proprietary acquisition format, or the AFF, that's on page 108. All right, and they will give you a log with that image as well as an inventory file or PDS. The compression, which is selected, uses CPM rather than EVE. So far, we've been using EVE. When you double-click your EVE format or file in your labs, it extracts that image file, and then you run your analysis on it. Imaging, capturing images with ProDiscover Basic. Here's how you do it. Start your split image, split it into whatever megs you need. It'll show it out in the sectors and show a destination, and then you'll update OK and set it in place. Next on that one is ProDiscover Basic. Destination, the format. ProDiscover format is recommended. That's what's default set. You are the technician, and the image number would be chapter 3. You can then choose compression, no compression, and a password. All right. Using the raw acquisition format, you do the same steps as you did for the proprietary format, but you'll select Unix style DD. That is method listed right here. All right. Raw acquisitions only saves the image data and hash value, and they create a log file or that PDS we talked about earlier. So with Access Data FTK Imager Lite, this is the free one that you can use for the ACE exam if you chose to go that way. It's included with the Forensics Toolkit, or FTK. Designed for viewing evidence and disk-to-disk image files or disk-to-image files, makes disk-to-disk copies and logical partition of physical drive lever and segment each image file. Evidence drive must have a hardware write blocking device or run from a live CD, such as Mini WinFE. All right, here we are in Access Data FTK. The only catch is it can't acquire a drive's host protected area. So if the host has a protected area, like boot to Windows or a master boot record, some of those become a problem. To use it, boot to Windows, connect to the evidence drive to a write blocker, connect to the target disk to a write blocker, start the process, which is opening image or light, creating an image, use the physical drive option, and then we've got the image type, case number, evidence number, description, you the examiner, and notes about that example or notes about that evidence. Choose the destination, that's where it's going to go to your forensics machine, and start your image. You get to see the summary and how it goes through and its progress. After that, you're going to validate it. And there's 3 to 5 different comments: CRC32, MD5, SHA-1, and SHA-512. These algorithms basically hold that image in a alphanumeric character value. If you make one small change, if you open it up and close it, that hash value changed. If you opened it up and made a more significant change, again, that hash value is going to change. If any image is altered, your chain of evidence has to reflect that. If you can keep that chain of evidence document with your hash values intact, like we talked about in the very beginning, you can rerun any forensics examination you need to as many different times as you can. But if you made an accidental boo-boo and you changed it, you basically have to either hopefully go back to your original or fix it, or scrap the whole case, or change your methodology and plans. So MD5 and SHA-1 utilities can be run on all your volumes to grab that. Now we talked about MD5, SHA-1, and 512, but there's also 256 and 384. Many of these algorithms get more and more detailed and more complex the higher the bit value is. SHA-1 versus SHA-5256 is a bit higher. It's a higher bit value, and then 512 to 256 is a higher bit value. So it gives you even more scrutiny about the actual value itself. Hashlogs outputs those results, and then you verify that to the original. Windows has no built-in hashing algorithm tools, so third-party utilities must be used. Commercial forensics programs also have no built-in validation tools. Each program has its own validation technique, and you can see all of the different SHA values or the validation techniques being used as you go through it, if you choose to look at those. I believe I do have a lab in here that will let you look at that. The separate manual validation is required for all raw acquisitions. So now we're going to talk about RAID, Random Array Independent Disks. Or it's a redundant array of independent disks. It's basically, instead of your home computer or laptop computer having one drive, it has several drives, and there are several reasons for doing this. So acquisitions is frustrating because how it's designed, configured, and sized. Size is the big concern here, because most of the time they are done to increase the size of data you have to what becomes a few megs, gigs, now becomes terabytes, petabytes of data. But redundant array of independent disks, or inexpensive. It was never inexpensive to do this. It was always very expensive. It involves 2 or more disks. That's the big kicker here. So if you got 2 disks, you can start RAID, and then the ceiling is pretty high. It's supposed to help data redundancy and data recovery and data, just ensuring that data remains available to the company or corporation or whoever chooses to use it. RAID is supposed to do increased storage and rapid access. The biggest disadvantage is it doesn't do any redundancy. RAID 1 is designed for data recovery. It's more expensive than RAID 0. And you can see RAID 0 is called striping, where it takes 128K files and divides them evenly over the disks you have available. Now remember, you have to have at least 2. So if you have 128K file, it all goes to that file. That's what we're used to as a normal user. If you go up from here, RAID 1 is mirroring, where it basically takes that 128K and copies it to both disk 1 and disk 2. So if disk 1 fails, disk 2 has it. If disk 1 fails with RAID 0, then the entire array fails, right? And that's where it gets tricky. This was the first two RAIDs that were ever available. That's why it's 0 and 1, all right? Now, somebody recognized that this was a flaw, so they came up with RAID 3 and 4. But all you really need to know is RAID 0 and 1. If you know 0 and 1, you got the basics of it. RAID 2 is similar to RAID 1, and that disk data is written to the disk on a bit level. It has better data integrity checking than RAID 0, but it's slower than RAID 0. RAID 3 uses data striping with a dedicated parity, and RAID 4 data is written into blocks. All right, so here we are with RAID 2 with the striping, okay? File 1 is written across all 4 disks. File 2 is also written across all 4 disks. I take that back. They're written across 3 disks, with disk 4 being your parity checker. So if disk 2 fails, you slap in a new disk, run a repair, and the disk 4 parity bits rebuild disk 2. The catch here is if disk 4 fails. If disk 4 fails, then disk 1, 2, and 3 can't be rebuilt. The catch, again, is they can't be rebuilt, but they're still probably functioning. So if you take out disk 4, slap in a new disk, and rebuild your parity index, you're back to the way you were. But if disk 4 fails, disk 3, 2, and 1 are still in operation, and you bought all the same drive from the same lot level, from the same serial SKUs, then you could run the risk of 3 or 2 or 1 failing when disk 4 failed. So it's a tricky checks and balances system that RAID is. RAID 5 is similar to 0.3, recovery bit on each disk. RAID 6 redundates or duplicates that parity bit on each disk, and RAID 10 is known as mirrored striping, or a combination of 0 and 1. We are in RAID 5, where disk 1, 2, and 3, and 4 all have parity bits, okay? And what's really cool about this one on RAID 5 is we have the distributed parity. So if disk 3 fails, not only did you lose part of file 2 and part of file 1, that's indicated by the dark gray band and the light gray band, you can then put in a new drive for disk 3, and it will then go forward and rebuild that index based off the parity bits from disks 2, 3, and 4. 4, 4, 4 out of that, 12 out of the 16. So it only has to rebuild one of that. If disk 2 fails, it has to rebuild file 1 and file 2. The 4K part of file 1, and 4K of file 2. Now, not every file, and this is what also makes it hard for a forensics examiner, is to get every disk, every bit part, every file part out of the bits on each disk. So if you look at file 1, it lives on disk 1, disk 2, and disk 3, but not disk 4. So if you image the entire array, or you look for it in the entire array, disk 4 isn't for that one file. Maybe that's a good idea, maybe it's not. It really depends on your investigation. So how much data is needed? What type of RAID is used? Do you have the right acquisition tool? And can the tool read forensically copied RAID image? And can the tool split the data saves of each RAID disk? Because it's not just enough to say, here's the entire RAID array, but you need each disk to make up that array. Sometimes small RAIDs going to one large disk is possible. But again, when we do RAID systems, we're doing something along the neighborhoods of like 40 terabytes, something really, really big on major companies. Vendors offering RAID acquisitions, ProDiscover, Guidance in Case, Xways, Access Data, Runtime, RTools. Occasionally it's too large, and then you can only go in to retrieve the data relevant to the investigation with a sparse or logical acquisition method. Occasionally, you're going to come against a SANS or a NOS. SANS is a storage array of networks, and NOS is network attached storage. Connecting them to a remote computer, you need to basically check your logs and see who accessed what, when they accessed it, go to the machine that did access it, find out who was using it at that time, make sure it wasn't a what we'll call a global login, that it's unique to that one user. The drawbacks is antiviruses, anti-spyware, firewall tools can ignore remote access programs. And sometimes the suspect could easily install security tools that alarm them to remote access intrusions. ProDiscover has an additional software called Incident Response that captures volatile state information, analyzes running processes, shows unseen files and processes, remotely listens and views IP ports, and runs hash comparisons, and creates that inventory all remotely. PD Server Remote Agent is ProDiscover's utility for remote access. It needs to be loaded on the suspect machine. PDS Server is installed from a trusted CD and is pushed out and remotely running. PDS Server can also run in stealth mode and can change the process name to appear as an operating system function. Remote connection security features like password protection, encryption, secure communication protocol, write protected, trusted binaries, and digital signatures exist. An in case shows that we have remote data acquisition of a computer's media and RAM with intrusion detection system tools, options to create image for one or more systems, previews of those systems, a wide range of system formats, RAID support for both hardware and software. Our tools is designed for data recovery, uses the triple data encryption or 3DES encryption, raw format acquisitions, and supports various file systems. USLAT Pro is developed by Whetstone. Connect Network's computer, perform a live acquisition of all drives connected to it. EVResponse is a vendor-neutral remote access utility designed to work with any forensics utility, and it's supposed to set up a security read-only connection. Allows for forensics examinators to examine it. 4 different versions of EVResponse: Enterprise, Consultant, Consultant Edition, and Tactical Edition. Other commercial acquisitions like Passmark, ASR Data, Runtime, iLook, IX, and SourceForge. Passmark has a source acquisition tool called ImageUSB for its OSF Forensics Analysis product, which creates a bootable USB drive. To do so, you'll need Windows XP or later and download ImageUSB from the OSF Forensics website. ASR Data Smart is a Linux forensics analyst tool that can make image files from a suspect drive, can produce proprietary raw images, and is capable of reading bad sectors, can mount drives in write protected mode, can mount target drives in read-write mode, and compression schemes to speed up acquisition or reduce the amount of storage needed. Runtime Software offers shareware programs for access, recovery, and acquisition. Disk Explorer for FAT and NTFS. Features the raw image creation, segmentation of the raw image, or compression for archiving purposes, and access network computers' drives. IX Imager runs from a bootable floppy or CD, designed to work with only iLook Investigator, and can acquire single drives and RAID drive supports. Parallel ATA or IDE, SCSI, USB FireWire should also support SATA as well, or serial ATA. SourceForge provides several applications, and its list of tools is thus. Forensics data acquisitions are stored in 3 formats: raw, proprietary, and advanced forensics formats. Acquisition methods like disk to image, disk to disk, logical disk to disk, or disk to data file, and a sparse data copy. All right. For your discussion, look into this. See which software you like can do the disk to image, disk to disk, logical disk to data, sparse data, which are most compatible with more forensics tools. Because if you pigeonhole yourself in one, You may leave off benefits of others. So do your research, figure out which is the more favorite, which one does the most, and which one you can get through. Several tools available for lossless compression is acceptable. Plan your digital evidence contingencies, make a copy of each acquisition. Write blocking devices or utilities must be used with GUI, that's your mouse pointer clicker acquisition tools, and always validate your acquisition. Linux live disks such as SIFT. Remember, Kali Linux isn't so great. Let's substitute in Kane or Def to provide useful tools for forensics analysis and acquisitions. Preferred Linux acquisition tool is DCFLDD, not DD. Use the right blocker for any acquisition, and to acquire the RAID disk, determine the right type of RAID and then select your tool appropriately. Network acquisition tools require installing a remote agent on the suspect computer. That's where it gets tricky, because if you don't have that remote agent running on your suspect computer, afterwards it's too late. All right, so that's what we've got for Chapter 3. Don't forget, we've got our Chapter 3 lab, Chapter 3 review questions, and Chapter 3 quiz. For your discussion, don't forget, it's one post and one reply for full credit. Otherwise, you're looking at 50% each shot. And for that, we'll see you guys next week.